Um, Hello, everybody. I'm Michael, one of the main organizers of this conference that we're kicking off today with this keynote by Brett Mills. And of course, I'm very happy to introduce Brett here today. Brett is visiting professor of media and cultural studies at Edge Hill University in the United Kingdom, and a member of the team currently undertaking two projects on multi-species storytelling that are funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, namely, on the one hand, multi-species storytelling, more than human narratives about landscape, and on the other hand, multi-sensory, multi-species storytelling to engage disadvantaged groups in changing landscapes. Brett's involvement in these projects is, in a certain way, just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his scholarly work in animal and non-human / more than human studies. Not only because we actually quoted the book in our call for papers, you will know that Brett is the author of the book Animals on Television, The Cultural Making of the Non-Human, which was published by Palgrave back in 2017. He has also authored a number of articles on the question of the animal in connection with film and television representation, some of which raised controversy, such as when, to quote a Christian website, he complained that wildlife documentaries are too family-friendly and need more gay animals. That was in response to an article that was published in the European Journal of Cultural Studies back in 2013. Some of his articles also caused least heated debate, such as when a Smithsonian magazine picked up on his reflections on animal privacy in the context of wildlife documentaries. That was in connection with an article that was published in the Journal of Media and Cultural Studies back in 2010. More recently, he has, for example, written about the meanings of animal death in Chernobyl, the HBO and Sky produced miniseries that's an article I would very much recommend anyone who's actually seen the show to read. Brett's second main field of research is in the field of television comedy, in which he has authored the books Television Sitcom, which was published by the British Film Institute in 2005, and The Sitcom, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2012. And he's also co-authored Creativity and the British Television Comedy Industry with Eric Horton, which was published by Routledge in 2017. Today's talk, however, as you will know, won't have much to do with comedy, and of course return us to the question of the animal. To draw on the description of his talk, this will be the story of Jaws from the shark's point of view, which I am very much looking forward to. Let's welcome Brett Mills.
Thank you, Michael. Let me just share my screen and hopefully you can all see that. Is that correct? Yes, that's good. Yeah, so I just wanted to say thanks, Michael, for the invitation in the first place, come for this conference, and the communication we've had since, and Anna as well. Thanks a lot. It's fantastic to see that this conference exists. Obviously, most of it taking place next week. Taking the issue of animals in American popular imagination and culture seriously and thinking that through. So it's a real pleasure to be invited along to give this keynote. I should just say before I start as well, so there's two bits of video in this talk. We've just tried the technology out and the sound worked. If it turns out when I try them now the sound doesn't work, let's not worry about it. It's the images that matter rather than us getting into a big technological debate. So when I go to some video, if you don't hear anything, don't worry about it. Just look at the pictures and I can carry on regardless. Okay, so this is Jaws from the shark's point of view. This is the story of my death. More than that, this is the story of my dying. It's the story of how I was killed and how I was made into something to be killed. I died because I died because a tale was told that necessitated my death. And that tale functions as legitimizing my demise too. My death is spectacular, and its spectacularity was necessary. It was the spectacle that rendered my death cathartic, my existence obliterated completely. But I survive as a tale. I died and became a myth, and it was a myth that was necessary, hence I had to be killed. This is the story of my death and how my death was made to be necessary. They have given me, and the story they tell of me, the name Jaws. Now, I've had no say over this name, nor the story of which I've been made to be a part. They assert their right to name me. They assert the right to tell my story. They assert these rights by the simple act of enacting them, never questioning their authority to do so. I have been made a monster, and they have named that monster Jaws. And what does it mean to be called Jaws? I am reduced to nothing other than a single part of my body, the part of my body that they fear. Though this is an odd choice, isn't it? Surely it's not my jaws they fear, it's my teeth or my mouth or my throat, or if they could conceive of it, my brain, my intelligence, my agency, my desires. So why jaws? When jaws are nothing without what they contain and what they sit in and what controls them. What stupidity led to them thinking of me as Jaws? Though Jaws is not the only name they've given me. They divide the world into these organizational structures they call countries, and they render unarguable these fictional boundaries through sheer will and ignorance of geography. And these things they call countries use different kinds of noises to make sounds. It amazes me how committed they are to the idea that their multiplicity of languages is what makes them special, when it instead means they've no tools for understanding one another. But more, I too am entrapped in this empire of nations, because they call me different things in different places. Now, some of these names render me in ways that they deem factual. I am simply, for example, shark, or the great white shark. Others give me names they think of as factual, killer shark, for example, but which reveal their failure to see their own propensity to kill. And then there's others where I just simply give up. Calling me jaws of death or the teeth from the sea helpfully displays their hatred of me and invites others to join in with that hatred. Elsewhere, I am a throat. I guess that makes a bit more sense. But look at this panoply of names. They simply cannot decide coherently what they think or how to name things. Nevertheless, this multiplicity of names shows how they assert their right to name me, to decide what I am, and to decide how my actions should be assessed. To name is to assert power over, and they do it again and again and again. And it seems to me they never consider what I might think of those names. They, of course, don't see me as worthy of consideration. I am, of course, a fiction. Can that be an excuse? It's a story, just entertainment, a bit of fun. Why should I take all this so seriously? But in this fiction, they are the tellers and I am the told. They are responsible for how they speak of me. That I'm a fiction makes it worse, because such stories rely on the possibility that all of this could be true. Their stories make sense, are comprehensible to them. That's the problem. Why should they so easily believe this concoction of untruths? And they have made me a shark. I am nothing other than my species. But what is this thing called species? They seem to rely on it so much and to think that its validity is self-evident. But they don't realize that this is a thing that they do to me. It is not who I am. This thing they call species is, after all, a fictitious grid that they place on nature. And this thing they call jaws is one of the ways they place this grid. It is the way they choose to see the world because it works for them. And why does it work for them? Because it means they can convince themselves that they can make sense of everything. These categories help them believe in their own analytical superiority. But get this, even they don't know what species means. They ignore the species problem. That is, the difficulty of reaching agreement about the definition of the species category. I could almost laugh. There is no agreed definition of this word that they rely on so much. They don't know what it means, this word species, and yet they yoke me into its realm, imposing it upon me with all the consequences this causes. But think how they use this idea of the shark and the stories they tell of it. These are the stories enabled because of their idea of the shark. Given their prevalence, I could be flattered. But look at what kinds of stories are told and tell me you take it as a compliment. I mean, I'm clearly of use. After all, no other animal on land or in the water generates the entertainment income that shark species do. Well, lucky for them that I'm such an income generator. But what does all this mean for me? I entertain them, but they fear me. And this fear, which I am told is just a story, affects how they treat me. They say I attack them, and they say this again and again in their news stories. These are the headlines they tell of me. So I attack them, do I? Let's be clear about who attacks who, shall we? The category they call shark kills on average 4 humans per year. And humans, in return, kill 100 million sharks per year. Now, let that sink in, if you'll excuse the pun. For me to kill the number of humans equal to how many sharks they kill in a year would take me 25 million years. Yet I'm the one who attacks. I'm the one who has to put up with story after story, both in the news and in fiction, of how I'm the attacker. I'm the bad guy here. It feels to me like they're using me as some kind of distraction. It's hard not to read this as evidence of some kind of inadequacy. I mean, if they're winning at this killing thing at a ratio of 25 million to 1, you'd think they'd be comfortable enough to admit it. But no, It's me who attacks, and it's me who must be called the attacker. And all the time, I and those that they have decided like me and who can be called sharks are attacked and killed. We die, and they call us monsters. And in doing so, the story they tell of me becomes the story of all sharks. My story, the evidence for how they think of all sharks. How they speak of me is how they speak of others. Our specificity rendered null as we become nothing but our species. If I am a shark, then that is not all I am. If I am a shark, that does not mean all sharks are like me. For me, being a shark is one among many factors that constitute me. For those who use me for stories, it is my beginning and my end. By what right do they decide what I am? So let me help out. Can I offer you a way in? How about this book? There's a human called Jacob von Uxküll, and he wondered how humans might make sense of experiences beyond them. He suggests everything a subject perceives belongs to its perception world, its Merkwelt, and everything it produces to its effect world, its Werkwelt. And these two worlds of perception and production of effects form one closed unit, the environment. I perceive and I act, just like them. It's not too hard. But maybe thinking like this means I might not be thought of only as something that attacks. I am a subject, and I insist on my subjectivity. You want more? You do know it's possible to think beyond the human, don't you? There's animal studies and there's critical animal studies, and they both offer tools for engaging with someone like me. Or how about a multi-species approach that focuses on the multitudes of lively agents that bring one another into being through entangled relations? They seem keen to engage with me. After all, they keep making films about me. So how about thinking about who I really am? But those are real animals in the real world. How might we do this for me, a story? Of course, they insist that I can be conceptualized, that my point of view can be shown, can be known, and more than that, that it can be shown. After all, this is what they call a point of view shot. They call this a point of view shot. But my point of view is not theirs. I sense the world through vibrations and through smell. And this thing called film cannot comprehend this. Think about this. For me, sight matters little. But for this thing called cinema, it matters so much. So how to solve this inconsistency? Rather than accept that film cannot depict my point of view because it cannot depict the senses that most matter to me, they instead reshape my engagement with the world into something that cinema can contain. My point of view is remade solely to render film's limitations invisible. They have accepted that it is right and meaningful to call this a point of view shot, because to do otherwise would require them to ponder the inadequacies of this medium and the world they make with it. Why do they not ask why it is this technology they revere so much is so limited? Well, they're not very good at seeing flaws in the things that they make. But more than this medium helps normalize their sensory engagement with the world, with sight and sound so normal as to be unquestionable. But I question it. This is not my point of view. It is theirs. Because here's what troubles them. They cannot comprehend my point of view, and that disconcerts them. For what is it to be human and not comprehend everything? I have my point of view and they can never access it. And that's okay. Why are they so insistent on their right to make sense of everything? This story they tell of me, they analyze and critique. They say the story is a classic and assert their right to do so. I mean, I don't see this story as a classic, and I query why they think they can judge the stories of others. Why didn't they ask me what I thought? They mine this story for its significance, for its meanings and its metaphors and its symbolism. Its power, they insist, arises from its universal truths, forgetting that their universe is not mine. And their only interest in those readings is them. Their egotism rampant as they find, surprise, surprise, that this story of my death is actually a story of them. See, they never question their own self-centeredness. And even their critiques work to deny that I exist. Their analysis of this classic film is a process they employ to assert that only they matter. Take this moment. It is described here in this book in this way. This book says, there is only one death in the film which is visible, and this is it. This supposed fact is asserted to indicate the power of this moment and to signal that in a film that is often understood to contain much that causes fear, death is actually largely absent. An interesting argument, worth pondering on. Yeah, if only it was true. After all, there is another death in this film which is rather visible, and that death is mine. This is a film, may I remind you, in which I die, visibly, shockingly, some of it in slow motion. It's not as if it's hidden. I explode. My body and its matter fill the screen. I sink, now dismembered, down beneath the sea. You saw it all at the start of this talk, and yet, according to this book, this death is not divisible. And not only is this death seen, it is celebrated. Here is one of those humans, happy I am dead and happy that he killed me. And I know how film works. In this shot of his reaction, you, as an audience, are invited to celebrate too. He looks and you look. That is the point of this sequence. So it's not as if my death is hidden. It is visible, it is spectacular, and it is categorized as good. So forgive me if I'm a bit confused by this statement that this death, shown here, is the only one visible in the film. And forgive me if I rewrite this quotation to make it more accurate. It is not the case that there is only one death which is visible in the film and this is it. It is that there is only one human death in the film which is visible and this is it. There's just one word missing here, and that is human. How could they make such an error of omission? But it's not an error, is it? They reveal themselves in this mistake. There's no need for them to append human to the term death, because for them, it's only human deaths that matter. Why, they think, bother mentioning that I die too? It's of no consequence. So in this little slip of the tongue, they reveal themselves and they reveal the assumptions they make. In a film whose climax depicts my obliteration, my death is not worth mentioning. The film renders me invisible, and analysis of it does too. I am doubly erased. But of course, that's the point. My erasure is their goal. And let me be an ally here. There is another death in this film which critiques of it fail to acknowledge. But it is, of course, not the death of a human. So why should they care? A dog called Pipit is seen in the film playing with a stick in the sea, but later his owner cannot find him and the stick is shown floating on the surface. Was I responsible? Well, it's impossible to know. The film does not say, but given it blames me for everything, it certainly hopes you'll assume I'm to blame. But this death too is typically absent in most analyses of the film. It's erased even more than mine. This dog dies simply to raise tension before the death you're invited to see as truly mattering, that of a human. The film says this death doesn't matter other than to prepare you for that which is really of significance. An analysis of the film does the same, where you will find a noticeable silence on discussion of this moment and the importance of the death of a dog. So I offer multi-species kinship here in these moments of death. My death and the death of a dog, seemingly invisible, certainly of less significance than those deaths of humans. Do you see how this film works to say only you, humans, matter? And do you see that analysis and critique of it does too? Two processes whose goal is to situate humans as all that matters. It's no wonder I might find this difficult to take. And you know how else they show that their interest in this story is not an interest in me, but only in themselves? It's in the readings they make of this film that assert it is about anything but a shark. Oh, the symbolism they see in this story and the symbolism they see in me. I am, it seems, able to stand in for so many things that matter to them and which preoccupy them, all things which are, of course, about them. You may be fascinated to know that I am, in fact, not a shark, but instead a toothed vagina womb. It's certainly news to me and does make me think I need to reflect on myself more. Furthermore, I am told I am a monstrous creature as phallic symbol. So I'm a bit confused now. Am I a vagina or am I phallic? Or am I somehow both? It's a lot of work for a shark, you know, being all of these things at once. And the story they tell of me is not, it seems, about their decision to kill me, but is instead the ritual telling of an essential patriarchal myth. A ritual, a myth. I'm tempted to be flattered to be such a vital part of the way they speak about themselves. I could see the idea that I am essential as something to crow about, until I realize this means essential to them and not to me. I am useful for things they deem they must do, but this considers not at all what this means for me. And then it gets confusing because it seems as if I'm about everything and nothing. This tale they tell of me is a propaganda film for America, and it works through the trauma of American defeat in Vietnam, while also being about Watergate. I mean, this is heady stuff. I'm pleased I can be about so many things. Does this not attest to my usefulness? And they seem to acknowledge the weight they attach to this story they tell of me and the absurdity of the number of things it's purported to be about, as there appears to be a tone of resignation in the statement that this film is about a lot of things. Well, I'm glad that's been cleared up. I might be tempted here to suggest this implies they decide what stories are about depending on what they need them to be about at that time, patting themselves on the back for their analytical complexity. But note here how all this is about them. I and the story I am entrapped in is nothing but a symbol, enabling them to work through their traumas and make sense of themselves. Because here's the thing, one thing recurring throughout these analyses is the implication that there's one thing this story is not about, me. In their rewriting of me as phallic, as a vagina, as about Vietnam, or about Watergate, there is one key thing, their denial of me as a shark. The work they do here is to deny that I have any meaning in and of myself, indeed to suggest that I only have meaning if I manage to say something about them. It's quite a considerable level of egotism to think that I only have meaning if I mean something for them and about them. Why are such analyses so invested in ignoring the fact of my existence? Yet, elsewhere, I am allowed to exist when they summarize this story that they tell of me. They reduce this tale to what they see as its essential and arguable elements. They summarize it as a story about a monstrous shark wreaking havoc on a Cape Cod town. Witness how casually they call me monstrous and how they deny the havoc they wrought upon me. They also say this tale tells the story of a series of shark attacks on a small New England seaside town and the ensuing battle with the culpable shark, with little regard for how easily they categorize me as culpable, how blithely they condemn others, with little energy spent on condemning themselves. They call this story a tale of shark terror. I think they aim to imply here that it is I who caused this terror, but I cheekily read this floating noun as indicating the terror I felt instead. Is it okay if I willfully misread what they intend, given they so insistently misread me? And they also say it is the story of a killer shark's effect on a New England tourist town. They are untroubled by the readiness with which they define me as a killer, in a story in which it is I who is killed. See how in these summaries they blithely construct me as the problem and them as the innocents? Well, I reject this. It is not only them who gets to decide how to summarize this story they tell of me. I will have a go too. So how would I summarize these events that led to my death? Simple. This is not a story of my monstrousness or my culpability or my effect on a New England tourist town. It is instead a story in which a fish eats food and is killed for doing so. Or it's a story in which an animal disturbs capitalism and capitalism says it must be destroyed. Or it's a story in which some humans decide they should control the seas as much as they control the land. Or it's a story in which violence is legitimized as a tool to reassert humans' dominance over animals. Why not? Why is this summary any less useful, any less true, any less meaningful than the ones they offer? So, to conclude, in their story, they kill me. And because of the ways in which their stories work, their story dies as I die. There is no more story because there is no more me. And there is no more me because there is no more story. But here I am, continuing to be. This story may end, but mine does not. I refute this ending, as it is an ending that serves their purposes alone, and these are not my purposes. So this is the story of my death, but I will not allow it to mean it is the story of my end. I live, I persist, I continue. I insist on being. I deny their right to kill me. Does that worry you? Good.
Thank you, Brett, for this thought-provoking talk. Before maybe questions, or let's wait a couple of seconds. Does anyone have any questions? As Anna was saying in the beginning, or comments. As Anna was saying in the beginning, you could either raise your virtual hand, or you could, of course, type your question in the chat. If you actually raise your questions, you're welcome or invited to actually turn on your cameras, but of course you're not required to. And Anna is apparently already eager to ask a question, so I'll give it up to her before I guess I have to enter
eager
the discussion.
I don't know. Anyway, first of all, thank you, because it was very I don't know, it was just even touching in a way. kind of presentation. I really liked it. And it made me think of a few things that I find they're often projected on sharks in popular culture narratives. Some specifically human things that are projected on sharks. And I don't know, for example, I play a game that is called Man Eater. And very sadly, I have to admit that I love it. I love playing it. But I just did the bare minimum to unlock the whole open world. And then it just float around as a shark and I do allegedly shark stuff. So I really enjoy it. But the narrative, the premise is horrible. And the narrative is basically that this is a pop shark and they killed her mother and she's going to grow and to get her revenge. And I feel that this revenge theme is often projected on sharks. Like, I mean, I'm sure that animals have their way to react and to remember and to trace back. But revenge? I mean, like in a vengeance plan, very articulated and very angry and very evil. And I feel that in many films, that's more or less what happens when there's shark attacks involved, you know. So what do you think about that, about the kind of emotions and attitudes and behaviors that we project on sharks in popular culture that are more human than animal? Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And this is the weird bit. I've often wondered whether I have to do the answers as the shark as well. I hope it's okay that I stop being the shark now and I can just be me for the Q&A. But it's a weird shift. Yeah, and it's funny because it's Jaws 3, isn't it, or is it 4? I'm trying to remember which one it is. Which is a revenge story, which is, yeah, Jaws 4's The Revenge. So, I mean, it explicitly kind of has that kind of embedded within it. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because the shark is both constructed usually in popular culture, though depending on the kinds of popular culture, because it is more complicated in some animation, in children's animation. But usually it stands in for some kind of robotic, instinctive, mechanical thing, while at the same time, as you say, something like revenge. But revenge is an interesting thing because revenge can be understood in a kind of robotic, instinctual, not thought through thing. So it makes sense that aspect, which if it's in a human story, might have a set of complications kind of added into it, and it might have a sense of kind of remorse or reflection on it as somebody's going through it. Whereas a shark instead can do revenge because there's a way in which that's an emotion or an act or an approach that we're able to read kind of just purely instinctively and mechanically and kind of emotionless. So it's this weird kind of, I know I'm getting dragged towards the word anthropomorphism, which is just complicated and I'd prefer to avoid, but this interesting thing of kind of connection to characteristics that we might understand as only human, though that's highly problematic. It does raise this interesting question, though, about whether actually a route into that, whether things like anthropomorphism or the acknowledgement of maybe animals having desires, goals, wishes, whatever we want to call that, can be a useful route into destabilizing that animal-human hierarchy. The other thing I was just going to say was, it's interesting you talked about games there, because the more that I've done about animal studies and so on, the more I find it really difficult playing games, especially the number of games you are, especially survival games, where you basically have to run around killing animals. And it's like, where's the vegan option in this game? Am I allowed to do this? No, I'm not. I must kill animals and eat meat. And so, yeah, the roles that animals are required to play in some games is interesting. And then I was going to suggest, have you played the Jaws board game, which only came out a couple of years ago? Because it's two teams, and one team is playing Hooper, Quint, and I've forgotten his name off the top of my head, which is really terrible. The three men, and one of you plays the shark. And the game doesn't really set it up as if the shark is the baddie. It's just two people against each other, and either the humans win or the sharks win. And the game is set up quite equally. And I sort of found it quite interesting playing that you can have a victory as the shark in the board game, and the game doesn't condemn you for that. It's a legitimate thing to do. So that thing that you're struggling with, maybe you need to buy the board game because it will enable you to get those kind of shark desires out, and not kind of tell you off for that. And normally the ways in which it's played, one person plays the shark and three people play three humans. So it's kind of 1 against 3, which is an interesting setup. So you actually also have this genuine kind of feeling of superiority if you win because you've beaten 3 other people. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I find a bit unsettling about this man-eater game, besides the title, is that while I'm doing my sharky things, you know, just floating around doing stuff, it is hyping me up to kill stuff and saying stuff, comments such as, oh, the bull shark is a very avid eater and is shredding all other animals apart and blah, blah, blah. But that's not quite what happens in reality, you know. It's just making this animal do stuff that normally wouldn't be doing. So, you know, yeah, maybe I should play the board game, and there's no floating around, but I might find a better shark outlet. I don't know.
Yeah. And it's a really good game as well, actually. So yeah, play it.
Thank you.
Thanks. So Antha, you have your hand up. Am I chairing, Mikhail? Are you chairing? Who's calling on people?
I actually just wanted, before just jumping in here briefly, because I wanted to add something, because you saying before the sort of oscillation in a certain way between, you know, this machinic behavior of the shark versus this cunning planning that's very much in place, and this sort of back and forth that we see in much popular culture. As a matter of fact, I find it interesting in a certain way that in the novel, if you've actually ever read this, there is actually this acknowledgement that they're expecting the shark to really behave in this, you know, machinic kind of way, you know, just reacting to impulses and stimuli. And at some point they start wondering whether it actually has a plan. So there is this sort of, at the very least, a little bit of a reflection on how this sort of, you know, construct expectations in a certain way about the shark.
And that, if I just, yeah, because the novel's kind of interesting. I mean, one, if any of you haven't read the novel, the ending of the novel is not completely different, but doesn't have the spectacular exploding ending. It's a very, very different ending, which tells us something about adaptations and cinema. But also it's interesting in the book that they do flip between calling the shark it and calling it him or he, and the pronouns change. And obviously those are really significant in terms of moving between it, a mechanical object, and he, which acknowledges some kind of not humanness, but some kinds of subjectivity. So yeah, the book, I mean, it's not a very good book, but it's kind of interesting, particularly compared to the film, about the different ways in which different forms of culture can engage with those kinds of experiences beyond the human.
Great, thanks. Samantha, your turn.
Yeah, so I have a little bit of an off-the-wall question that's going to be a little windy, but I was thinking about other representations of great white sharks when you were like putting up all the different film covers, and I came upon Finding Nemo, which is specifically interesting, and this is just like a tip of the hat, but I think it's relevant, is that they name the shark in Finding Nemo Bruce, which is after the shark in Jaws. The physical, like mechanical shark they used, they had nicknamed Bruce, apparently. And I think that the Bruce in Finding Nemo is interesting because they have the fish are friends, not food, like the they're trying to be vegan sharks, I guess, which almost makes this the exact reversal of these like shark monster movies where not only are the sharks in Finding Nemo, like all three of them, supposedly not eating fish, therefore they're not eating humans either. And it's the only film that I could think of where the shark, the point is not to kill the shark. In fact, the sharks are very much alive at the end and are friends with Dory, one of the main characters, right? So I was just wondering, one, if there are other films where the sharks are like positive. I realize that it's a children's film, so obviously they're not going to have a bunch of like monster effects, but also, what is that kind of saying about almost counter to this of sharks as a positive influence? Like the sharks ultimately move the plot along in an important way.
Well, let me take the second part of that first, and that's mainly because I can't think of any of the examples off the top of my head. Others might come up with them. I mean, actually, the interesting thing you've noted there is about it being a children's film. And it is the case that there's way more space in children's culture, particularly animated culture, but also children's books, for animals to fulfill a whole bunch of roles and for there to be kind of productive relationships between humans and animals than there is in adult culture. It's a much nicer space, if that's an okay way to put it, where as a viewer, as a human viewer, you are invited to understand animals as individuals, as characters, and all that kind of stuff. Whereas that's really quite rare in adult culture. And when I'm talking about culture here, I'm obviously talking about Western culture. It's different in different parts of the world. And there is that argument about the ways in which, and there's quite a bit of research showing this now, that kind of the attitudes we have towards animals, we have to learn that children don't have them. And the kind of hierarchies that exist in adult culture between humans and animals are things that are learned, and that children have much more kind of porous boundaries, and their realm of consideration in terms of ethics goes way beyond humans. And that it's as we get older, society teaches us, no, humans matter, and we should see animals as less important and inferior. So actually, I mean, I'm very, very positive about loads of children's culture. You give an example like that, kind of doesn't surprise me. And you can see that even more, say, with animals that in adult culture we would largely understand in terms of meat, that cows and pigs and so on, which you will very rarely see depicted in adult culture because they're meat, you see in lots of children's culture with things like, Peppa Pig and all that kind of stuff. There's loads and loads of stuff to do with those kinds of animals. So actually, the children's culture thing is a really, really useful thing. And the question is, how do we turn those sets of kind of non-anthropocentric attitudes, which children have and which children have usually, and which children's culture has, how do we translate that into adult culture? And why is it that shift kind of happens?
If I could just respond quickly, it makes me think of the experience that some other people here might have had of like a childhood vegetarian phase, where there's a decent amount of children that refuse to eat meat at some point in their childhood and then are like forced to grow out of that because it's counter to what their parents and society expect them to do. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, there's all that work on kind of the culture of meat, and also it connects to masculinity and capitalism and so on. And one of the ways you learn to become a citizen in the cultures, I guess, many of us kind of grew up in, there was ways in which you learn to become a proper citizen, adult in that, is through the consumption of meat and particular attitudes towards animals. That's the process. I mean, we use that language. If somebody cares about animals too much, if an adult cares about animals too much, one of the things we might call them is childish. That's literally a word we use. The idea is that you're meant to kind of put that away, which is very odd and problematic.
Thank you. It seems like no one here can come up with a positive portrayal of a shark, because there's also no comments in the chat. Claudia, please.
Hi, Brett. Thank you for your talk. Wonderful as ever. Thank you. I was sort of drawn back to, as you were talking, which I found, by the way, in a very creative way, how you enter the shark's point of view, and it's very refreshing to see conferences or lectures delivered from that, having that sort of effect. But I was reminded of, as you were speaking of, I was like, oh, where did I read this about Peter Benchley sort of regretting having written Jaws and whatever, and I was going through my library and I recovered it, where he says something like, and this is in Rothfeld's Representing Animals, right? And he says something like, I couldn't possibly write Jaws today, not in good conscience anyway. I wouldn't do it at all. I wouldn't try to demonize an animal. Society has changed and the perceptions of animals have changed. And to write a book today in which an animal is the conscious villain is not acceptable anymore. I don't mean acceptable from the political correctness point of view. I mean acceptable morally and ethically and every other way. And I think it's, it's very telling of coming from the 1970s, if already there might be those sorts of perceptions that may pose a cautionary sort of stance with regards to as to how we represent animals. They're good to know. But I was also reminded, as you were speaking, of that other very not too popular a movie, but I guess it was known at the time, Orca. I was looking up what year it was from, 1977. So a couple of years after the first Jaws comes out, with Richard Harrison and oh God, I can't remember the name. Oh, Charlotte Rampling, right? And this ties in with the first question with regards, it's this sort of very much a revenge tale, very much anthropomorphized, and the father of this orcapod, going on this killing spree against all the humans that sort of hunted down his partner and their baby to come, etc., their whale. And I was thinking of how cetaceans, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, I'm not too clear, but how they have or they've sort of come out of that monstery image in an easier way than that sort of serial killer image that sharks may have, and coming in from Moby Dick and going through Orca, and then a few years later we have something like Free Willy, which again ties in with the whole idea of it being a children's film. But I was wondering, if what sort of things do you think could make sharks sort of charismatic? I mean, in the sense of people effectively caring for them and not necessarily just being fascinated by them. And I was thinking about all this stuff you were talking about, the point of view and whatever. It's like, well, for one thing, I think sharks don't, I may be wrong. I think they don't blink, and that just makes people very uneasy. Just like in Terminator, when the bad guy doesn't blink either, or whatever, there's something about not blinking, and with that whole eyesight and point of view that you mentioned, that just makes it all that more mechanical. But I just wanted to know your impressions regarding what do you think is missing in terms of shark physicality or whatever that could make, I don't want to use the term species, but that could make the shark family, let's put it in those terms, more effectively magnetic towards people, as opposed to being, because I get the feeling that when we watch Shark Week or something like that, it's still very much about awe and fascination, which is fine for conservative purposes, I guess. But I'm wondering about emotional, if there's a possibility of a sort of emotional connection there, and what is it about the physicality of the shark in particular, beyond being a fish, I guess, and not a mammal, that do you think might be sort of the wall that we keep bumping our heads into? I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's and thanks for pointing out that Benchley stuff. So yeah, he's regretted he's regretted all the kind of consequences of Jaws for a long time, and obviously, and worked in conservation for quite some time. I kind of think, say, certainly in Western and European culture, the battle has been lost. This is how the shark is now understood, and trying to reshape that is virtually impossible, other than actually the examples from children's culture that were mentioned earlier, and that, you know, this stuff, these things happen in a generational way. And so there's a set of kind of cultural meanings that we carry around with us that are very difficult to emotionally disrupt. And the only ways in which those shift really are kind of in a generational way. So what ways in which particular animals are being understood and presented to children can make a difference. The other thing I worry about a bit, actually, and I understand the kind of pragmatic logic of it, is, and I know this is not what you're saying, and you're just kind of talking pragmatically about it, is kind of the implication that in order for us to have some kind of moral concern for another animal, we have to develop some kind of, you know, we have to have some kind of emotional connection to it. And we have to kind of accept there's going to be some sorts of animals, because of how they look, that is never going to happen. But actually, it's a real problem if we, you know, it leads to the whole charismatic megafauna kind of idea, that it's much easier to raise money for particular kinds of animals rather than others. So I don't know whether we need to get to a point where we go, do you know what, sharks are scary and I hate them, but at the same time, they exist, they have a right to exist, and we shouldn't kill them. And those things can happen simultaneously. And so, I mean, I know that conservation work has been very effective in using those techniques that you're talking about. And so I'm not completely dismissing those. And the work that Claire Parkinson has done on anthropomorphism talks about that as actually, even though it's problematic, a really useful tool for changing how people think about animals. So I'm sold on all of that. At the same time, I worry that the opposite is, if we can't find that, then it's legitimate for us to be horrible to that animal. And at some point we might just have to go, we can't make a connection with this, but that doesn't matter. But I know that's kind of, I also know that's kind of difficult.
No, yeah, I agree to but it's a difficult sort of ground, and I'm sorry, I'll finish up with this, but in relation to that, you know, thinking of, oh goodness, like my octopus teacher, for instance, something so remote, so inconceivably distant from what a human being is, and I get that the narrative around that particular story, trying to weave this conservationist message in there, and yeah, it does tend to go back to emotion, I guess, and overcoming one's trauma and whatever, and all that is anthropocentric in the end. So I would agree, but I don't know, it is a problematic issue. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I mean, actually, just to connect that, there's something about the sea. The sea is alien for most humans, and right, that's okay. I mean, actually, if it's worth me knowing, that's the kind of impetus for this talk. I was in the sea, and I don't really like going in the sea. It scares me a bit, and I was kind of being scared, sort of going, oh God, what if there's fish here? You know, I can't remember where I was, but anyway, and I was abroad on holiday, and then I was like, what if a fish attacks me? And then my brain kind of went, well, actually, I'm in this fish's world, so it's got a right to attack me. And then I started thinking about Jaws. Mm-hmm. And actually, that's where this talk came from. And it was where I kind of went, do you know what? It's okay if I'm a bit scared to be in the sea. I'm not meant to be here. And so why am I insisting that this place, I should feel safe and secure in? It's not my home. And so if I feel a bit uncertain about it, maybe that's fine. And actually, you know, that connects into the history of what's happened with sharks. The whole putting up of shark nets in Australia and all that kind of stuff has all been about how can we make the sea as safe as possible. And it's interesting in terms of the history, the history of the word attack for shark attack, and Christopher Neff has done interesting work on this. where it didn't really exist until about the 1920s. And in Australia and before that, if you went in the sea and got attacked by a shark, it was generally understood as your fault for going in the sea.
Rightfully so.
Yeah, it was your fault. And it was a very deliberate, conscious, in fact, done by various sort of coastal regions in Australia and so on, to protect the shores, to get newspapers to call them shark attacks and to say that when this thing's happened, it's the shark's fault, not yours. It's only come around in the past 100 years. Wow. It's not how we culturally understood that interaction for much of our history. So we've had to kind of make that and to understand the idea. And shark attack, which is a completely normal term, is a relatively new term.
What's the name? And I'm sorry for the, what's the name of that article or that study?
Christopher Neff, who's written a lot about, in Australia, about kind of sharks. He's written about Jaws and so on. And about kind of shark policy in Australia. Really, really interesting. And when I came across that article, because yes, shark attack is just one of those terms you have in your head. And he constructs the history and says, it's quite a new term, you know, and you have to think of it as an attack. You know, that has to be made. It's not normal. We could instead understand it as something else, and we don't.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for the question also, of course, Claudia. I'll probably butcher the name. Sudirta?
Yeah, that's okay. I'm really sorry for not being able to turn on my camera because of internet issues, but I love the discussions too much to not jump in. Firstly, tailing on Samantha's question and sort of answering it a little, I had a similar doubt. This is again a little winded and more of a comment, but I know of 3 other animated films, like sort of DreamWorks Shark Tale, all of them children's animated films where sharks are depicted as animals who are both good and evil, to put it simply. And one of the protagonists is a shark who befriends a smaller fish who is normally a prey item. And there's this other film called the DreamWorks Bad Guys, which released recently. This new film considers a shark as a misunderstood animal that is discriminated by human society, but finds a way to turn it around. Similarly, in another film, Back to the Outback, the shark is depicted as a primary founder of a society for ugly animals. That's literally what it's called, and it's composed of members like snakes, crocodiles, scorpions, and spiders who would normally cast in a similar monstrous light. So my question is sort of that these anthropomorphized animals compose both the non-human animal's gaze, or what we imagine them to be, and the humanized point of view as well. So does this anthropomorphism help them in a sort of way by positing them in a positive light, or does this create unrealistic ideas of the animals in minds of, for lack of a better word, impressionable children?
I think my answer is going to be both. It does both of those. I mean, it's interesting. I find very often when I present on these kinds of things to people who aren't from animal studies, the first word they will latch onto is anthropomorphism and go, this is anthropomorphic. And nobody ever says this is anthropomorphic and it is bad, because it's just anthropomorphism is just this bad thing. It's assumed we all know it's bad. And as soon as you kind of say, well, why is anthropomorphism bad? People go, oh, well, we've all agreed it's bad, isn't it? We don't have to say why it's bad. And it depends how it's done. I mean, I think like all forms of representation, there's good anthropomorphism and there's bad anthropomorphism. So it depends what purposes it's put to and what it's trying to do. And actually the idea of imposing upon others particular kinds of characteristics as a way of making sense of something. I mean, I think very often, it's like if we talk about if animals love or hate or those kinds of things, which people are really uncomfortable using those kinds of terms. And I understand it in terms of translation. It might not be exactly the same, but all we're doing is translating an animal concept into a human one, and that's a useful word for doing it. So I'm comfortable with that language in the same way as human languages, when we translate from one to another, very often we don't 100% capture the meaning, but it's good enough in order for communication to occur. And it's not something I know enough about, but I really want to look at translation studies as a tool for thinking about this, because obviously translation acknowledges that there are problems in that process, but that it's still a productive and useful thing to do in order to develop kind of communication, kinship, understanding, and so on. So it depends on the anthropomorphism. And of course, some forms of anthropomorphism are ones where, and March of the Penguins, for example, would be a perfect example of this, where it's clear that animals are being used there solely to kind of construct an idea of nature, which then legitimizes particular kinds of human behavior. And therefore I would go, oh, that's bad anthropomorphism, because its only purpose is to restate a particular, usually conservative, idea of human normalness. Whereas anthropomorphism, which is about genuinely trying to extend and blur the boundaries between humans and others, I think is useful, depending on how it's done. And then the other part of that is, in this talk, the shark, not me, the shark critiqued the idea of species. And of course, we also have to critique the word animal, because it's such a big, containing billions
of homogeneous category,
And so, so all this kind of stuff. And I think what can make a difference, there's a difference between anthropomorphizing sharks and anthropomorphizing a shark. Because there's a difference between kind of going, all sharks behave in this way, saying this particular shark does this. And it seems to me that is one of the really powerful things that can be done, say via anthropomorphism, but via a whole bunch of other techniques, is the individualization of the animal, which of course we do with pets all the time. So we're used to kind of doing that. But very often when we're talking about animals in the wild, in nature, we just end up with these species categories. Monkeys do this, sharks do this, parrots do this, rather than going, this parrot, this monkey, this shark. And that's a really powerful shift when you force somebody to understand it as an individual. And it's kind of what I was hoping to do, I hope I do with this talk, is to try and go, this shark, which is, simply a shark, is also an individual. So what does that mean? And once you're confronting an individual, that completely reshapes your relationship to something. That felt like a very long answer.
No, that was really helpful. Like, it's actually easier to, I think, anthropomorphize certain, I won't say species, but kinds of animals who are sort of closer to us, like charismatic megafauna and mammals and birds over reptiles, amphibians, and stuff like that. I've seen this.
Kind of. I think it depends how closely you look at them. There was, for example, during the recent heat wave, there was a bee that nearly died on our windowsill. It clearly had no liquid, and I went and got a little. I'd been told by somebody, get a teaspoon, put a little bit of sugar in it, and it'll drink that up. And I went, and I thought this will never work, and I went and did it. And this bee drank that liquid, sat there for a bit, and then flew off. And it seemed to me, so like a bee would be an animal that I think we would think it can be difficult to anthropomorphize because it's so kind of attached. But actually looking at that animal, exhausted, having a drink, having a rest, and then setting off, I genuinely felt like this makes as much sense to me as if a dog had done this, or as if an elephant had done this, or whatever. So I think it's about that kind of close, attentive looking and seeing. And it's the question of about different kinds of behavior. And so I have seen loads and loads of documentaries, obviously, about bees and other insects going around collecting pollen and in there. But I've never seen one of them tired and drinking some liquid in order to rehydrate on a hot and sunny day. And so it's about those kinds of stories that we tell and thinking, are there other ones which are comparable to ours? And I don't know that I'm necessarily anthropomorphizing that animal when I did that, because he was clearly nearly dead. He needed a drink, and then he was better. That's that. And I could go, I felt like that sometimes. This seems kind of a logical connection to make.
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
No questions currently then. Just a follow-up concerning the individualization of animals, I guess. Isn't this in a certain way, especially when we're talking about sharks, also kind of dangerous? Because at the end of the day, this is, what this totally problematic concept of the rogue shark at the end of the day is about, you could argue, it's an individual of the species that acts different from how sharks are supposed to act, right? It's one individual, and thus at the end of the day, we also need to defend humans in a certain way, because there might be 1 in 1,000 sharks or something that might act in ways that we don't necessarily appreciate. So of course, I get the idea that of course you need the individualization in a certain way. On the one hand, this is also something, of course, that goes hand in hand with Derrida and animals versus the animal. But especially with sharks, I feel like there's also this counter argument that could be made in a certain way, that there is this entire discourse about individual sharks that has had this negative effect on our relationship with them.
Sort of, except I don't know that that's individualizing. If you take a group and you say that group, whether this is animals or whether it's human cultural categories, if we were saying this about a race or a gender or people from a particular nation or whatever, and said, oh, we need to be careful of them because they have a propensity for there to be a rogue one from that nation, from that gender, from that race or whatever. Even though we're talking about a rogue one, we're talking about that group. We're kind of not individualizing. We're saying somewhere in this group, there's that problem. And the very fact that you might impose that beforehand, whereas individualizing is discovering that as you encounter an individual. Right. In the same way you do, again, with a human being. We individualize because we meet somebody. What's your name? What do you do? And you discover their personality. That's individualizing, which is different from, oh, I assume all people of this gender or all people of this race or all people from this nation are X, even if 1 or 2 aren't. So yeah, I see what you mean. The kind of rogueness and the individualness could be understood as that, but you're still lumping everybody together in order to be able to mark one out as a rogue, I think.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Any final questions? Seems like the audience has run out of questions. So thank you, Brett, for again this great talk. Also, as a couple of comments in the chat pointed out, this kind of different approach, and also, of course, Claudia pointed it out, this kind of different approach of doing a talk in the humanities is much appreciated. And of course, it raised a number of questions that we'll be struggling with in the next couple of days and next week in particular, concerning the representation of animals, but also this entire question of anthropomorphization, as you were saying, and how can we tell animal stories at the end of the day. So thanks again for this great talk. A round of applause, virtual round of applause maybe.